I invite you to go to either the Davidson College website or UIC's website to learn more about her. For now, I want to just share a few things about her. Dr. Hilary Green. She is the James B. Duke Professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College currently. She earned her BA in History with minors in Africana Studies and Pre-Healing Arts from Franklin and Marshall College. Her MA is in History from Tufts University, and her PhD in History is from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her first book, and it was entitled Educational Reconstruction, African American Schools in the Urban South, 1865 to 1890. And a lot of us who are part of UIC, I'm sure will be very interested in that because we've done a lot of study around that area. It explored how African Americans and their white allies created, developed, and sustained a system of African American education schools during the transition from slavery to freedom in Richmond, Virginia, and Mobile, Alabama. Her second book, which is almost ready for publication, it is tentatively titled Unforgettable Sacrifice. It examines how African Americans remembered and commemorated the American Civil War and its legacy. And I can't wait for that to come out because, again, we've done a lot of study around that. And we've talked more about, many of you are familiar with the Lost Cause, and which is basically a mythology about the Civil War. And it contains no reference to Black folks. So it will be nice to get that perspective, which is just too often not shared. A couple of interesting points for me about Dr. Green. Her scholarly passion grew out of her formal and informal educational experience as a native Bostonian. Do we have any other Bostonians or near Bostons in the house? Okay. She attended the Brockton Public Schools and regularly vacationed in South Central Pennsylvania and in the Charleston, South Carolina Low Country. Those are where her peeps are to this day. Another interesting thing about Dr. Green, a lot of her writing and editing and research happens at bars. So she's one of us. And lastly, those of you who know me know I'm not a big animal person, but I'll forgive Dr. Green. She has 3 cats. and maybe she'll share their names with us when she comes up. So with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Green to come to the podium.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And one of the things about my biography is because of family history is where I'm a Civil War historian. My mother's side of the family is from the other side of Gettysburg, and they have been there since 1810 as free people of color. They still live in those counties, and I had 10 relatives on that side of the family served in the Civil War in USCT regiments. And then my dad's side of the family, they were enslaved on James Island, Johns Island, Wamala Island, and they live on air land in the Charleston area. And I grew up in Boston. And I was connected to the New Bedford and rich Bostonian African-American community who did a lot of this work, including William Carney's descendant, who was a frequent attendant. Then he had going to my church and my public schools and talking about his family history. So I grew up learning about Civil War memory and history from people's porches, from their community archives and their scrapbooks. And then going to Gettysburg every year. My parents have pictures of us as toddler little kids up until 18 at Gettysburg, but also on the Charleston Battery and also everywhere else. So for me, this was part of my childhood and why I did Civil War. But my cat names too also reflect Civil War memory. I have a Rutherford B. Hayes, and his litter mate was Lucy Hayes, but she passed away when she was 14. Rutherford just turned 16. And I have a James A. Garfield and a Lucretia Garfield. So if you know anything about those are Civil War presidents. And they're also tied to my own research. So even by every day, it's there. So for me, one of the things I want to talk about is how do we get to these monument debates and how do we get around what debates used to be centered on. Those are those monuments erected during the Jim Crow era to the Lost Cause. Can I have the next slide, please? Why don't we look at this monument? This is Sonia Clark created this flag of surrender using tea cloths at the end of the Charleston Massacre. She was very much attuned to the Confederate symbols and artwork around them, deconstructing to bring about healing. And this massive, it was 20 feet wide, 14 feet down, tea-dyed, hand woven, and on display at now several different museums. And she goes to question about why don't we talk about this flag, this cloth symbol of the monument debates, not just the physical monuments, but these debates. Once we start thinking about also how the Civil War was remembered across people's experiences based on family history, community history, engagement with the war, and also to those who did not serve and were conscientious objectors to the war. Where do they fit into this narrative? And so to get us to think about what if this was the symbol that endured. Can I have the next slide, please? Because these monuments, there are several ways in which these Confederate monuments that dominate the debate come up. The early ones are when I would say the original phase before they become public. That's in cemeteries. And this is where white women, Black women, indigenous women, and all women of the Civil War era have something in common. They are putting up, making sure headstones for those who died during the Civil War are placed. They are caring for cemeteries and the wartime dead. And it's more private celebrations and commemoration of this dead in spaces that they can control. These monuments, in smaller numbers, we start to get around the 1870s because of the Lost Cause. And I'm glad you had Karen Cox here. She is still one of the best scholars who've written about the UDC and the Lost Cause and the history of the monuments from the beginning to the present. And so for me, when they start going public under the Ladies Memorial Associations, these monuments were put up in very few public spaces, but also in public spaces where Black civil rights and Reconstruction gains were starting to be overturned. And so when we start seeing violence around this and this collaboration of putting up monuments, it also means the retrenchment of Reconstruction. So that's when we see that big spike. That is the height of lynching. That is the height of disenfranchisement. That is the height of the emergence of Jim Crow education. That's the height of the revamping of the cultural landscape that creates what we know as Jim Crow. And that's with the removal of Black political voice, actual removal through assassinations and killing of people who resisted. These monuments are allowed to flourish. And they go up in a rapid way. Then it kind of goes down. Around the 30s, the 40s, and 50s, this is where we start seeing other monuments getting done in battlefields, but also international. One of my favorite Confederate monuments I've seen was in Quebec. I was in Montreal. And I'm like, what's this French monument sitting on the side of the Hudson Bay building? And I'm like, oh, this put up in the 50s. Okay, this makes sense. But so they go international with these monuments too. So they're not just in the US, but also highways and highway markers and marking the other type of landscape that are not just in town squares and cemeteries. The next wave is really during the Civil Rights Movement. And this is where we start to see the clash of African Americans who are protesting at courthouses. When you look at those pictures, especially ones like in Tuskegee, Alabama, Mississippi, the Greenwood, Mississippi one, and others, you'll start to see they're usually leaning against a Confederate monument as they're protesting for civil rights because they're claiming the same space to advocate that they are citizens. So we start to go from another way to mark that landscape, and it's also the centennial of the Civil War. We do have monuments still being put up today, but we could put this timeline going further out, we would see a decline. And it's in that decline I'll talk about the end that we are seeing now more removals than we are seeing monuments being put up. Can I have the next slide, please? Because this is where they're located. And you notice they're predominantly in the South, but they're not only in the South. And this map here is really reflective of where the Confederate monument debates have been really going full circle from the beginning. And that's on the streets and the communities like Cornelius, like around North Carolina, because these monuments were always challenged. But when we overlay the lynching maps of EGI and others, we'll start to see there's some connections here too. And with these monuments, if we go to the next slide, one of the things that I'm also seeing, we're also seeing the other monuments now being put up. And if you have not gone to the EGI Peace and Justice Memorial, please do. This is from the dedication weekend. I miss living up the road from this because I've been there over 20 times now. Every time when I take students, they find family members. Every time I go, I'm there seeing whole communities coming in because for them, this is their memorial because where their family members who were lynched, they didn't get a body. They couldn't have a burial. This is also for them, this is their response to the violence that took their lives as a height of the Confederate Memorial. And it's through this and going through and this shared collective remembrance, but the power of the name at the same time as those Confederate monuments, we're starting to see healing. So one of the things I like, how do we add new monuments to also respond to the other factors of the Confederate monuments? How do we have different conversations? But these are going to be hard conversations because this is also in the living memories of communities. This is the living trauma that some people will see when they go by a memorial. When they go and hear people claim heritage, but they're like, my heritage was of the Civil War too. My heritage was denied of me by someone being lynched in my family. My heritage was denied here. And so how do we listen and develop community-based solutions, but also recognizing the power of these memorials too? So the first time I went to this memorial was dedication weekend. And what I found interesting was not the memorial, was the very small protest outside of the memorial, 2 blocks away. And that was the current chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy that was out there. And it was quite interesting to watch them be walked by, people singing, "We shall overcome," "Lift every voice and sing," "Amazing Grace." And then, as I came out, a very serious conversation between Black pastors and ministers of the area, civil rights activists, and the women coming together and talking. So I thought it was going to be a different scene when I went in. But we all, in the end, and I've had subsequent meetings when their various groups are in the room, but this helped in Montgomery change because now in Montgomery, this is the #1 tourist attraction. The Civil Rights Trail in Selma, Birmingham, and Montgomery, is the second and third largest tourist industry for Alabama. Huntsville beats them, because that's NASA. So in a state even like Alabama, this pass and response to these monuments is also generating different type of conversations. That we did have some Confederate monuments removed. Some people paid the $50,000 fine for that removal, but that was done by someone cutting a check because they agreed this had to go. So the power to have these conversations now is important. Next slide, please. So when I talk about memorials, especially with my students, the dedication speeches is where we start to understand the framers of these memorials and what their intent was. As a student who went to UNC Chapel Hill when Silent Sam was still there, as a student, I did not walk by Sam. Because when you go by memorials like this, you see what Caretha Mitchell, who's an academic scholar who is republishing a book about Harriet Jacobs' narrative, a new critical edition of it. You get told of your place and you're not belonging there. And she calls it the know your place aggression. And I refused to go by Sam as I was getting my PhD and tell me to know my place that I didn't belong. So my geography on this campus always changed. But as a result of this, one of the firm teaching materials I always did when I talked about UNC and others is I went to the archives and we read Julian Carr's speech. And I taught that speech every year, and I still teach that speech. So that speech, and next slide, where he brags of horsewhipping an African-American woman, made that monument and also other Black women of the time in North Carolina understand the threat level to them. Because 3 years earlier, when Cornelius was putting up their monument, Black women in Hertford, North Carolina put up a monument to Black Civil War veterans. And that monument comes up before the United Daughters of the Confederacy monument goes up. So Black women beat Silent Sam. So when they hear this speech and he talks about and brags on a college campus, surrounded by a pretty much all-white audience, of horsewhipping a Negro wench, when it's middle-class Black women 3 years earlier in Northeast North Carolina put up a monument, they understood what this meant. So the enacting of violence, the enacting of these memorials, when you read these dedications, they're very clear about what is the new society, the values of this generation, and it's one that it's one way only. Because it also neutralizes other dissenters. Those who fought for the federal armies and navies are not included in this. Those Quakers, especially in North Carolina, who did not fight, are not included in this. And Black people are not included except for to be seen as the racial inferiors of the monument builders. But that being said, next slide. People resisted. Every single memorial that gets put up, I didn't find it for Cornelius, but I did find it for Chatham County and other ones in North Carolina and throughout the South. I'm working on an exhibit for the LA Museum of Arts. They are next 2023 or 2024, it's taking some time. They are displaying 30 of the removed memorials from the summer 2020 and 27 in an airport hangar, because these things are big. And they're having them on display contextualized by artwork. And I had the fortune to write an article for this exhibit catalog where I got to highlight future educator of South Carolina, Mamie Garvin Fields. She was a club woman, she was an activist, and she was a long-term teacher. But when she saw the first Calhoun monument, because this is the second one, the first one is removed and another one is put up in its place that's taller and less subject to harassment by Black children who used to sing John Brown's Body, use it as target practice, use shoe paint and shoe polish to mark it up anytime they went down Charleston. Because like Field said, when they saw this, it produced a violent reaction to them, like, this is my city, this is my community, I belong. I reject what it's telling me. And I talk about this in my upcoming book, which I turned into the press on Monday. It's almost there. She's in her 80s when she recalls this to her granddaughter. It was still visceral in her mind what it meant to see that Calvin monument. And it's this reminder of Fields and others that to say, like, people rejected them outright. They did what they could. But when we talk about there's no dissent, well, we know there was. Next slide, please. This one, too, dedication weekend. John Mitchell Jr., who I studied as when he's a very young child in the African American public schools of Richmond, Virginia. He becomes a short-term, he teaches for a couple of years and then becomes the editor of the Richmond Planet. When the Lee Monument goes up in 1890, he publishes several editorials decrying the whole thing. And in the black newspaper and press, he was one of the few that mounted the resistance to it. However, the monument still went up. Others did too. Because when you control the political landscape, when you control who has a voice, if they speak out too much, you use lynch law to eliminate dissent. These people can be ignored too. So Mitchell was one of the people who spoke out actively. Maggie Lena Walker, also from the Richmond community, John, other women and men and children did too. There has always been a long resistance to these memorials. So I liked what happened during summer 2020 was a reclamation of this space and how Black Richmonders responded in a way that they always wanted to respond to it. They made it into their space. They marked it up with Black affirmations. There were basketball games here. There were dance parties on this space. They reclaimed all of it, and at night, they used projections to put Black history and memory on top of it. And the one image that there's two images I love that were projected, was Frederick Douglass was one of those individuals that was projected on this monument one of the nights. But another one was a USCT soldier from the Civil War. And that one really struck home for me because one of my ancestors, Joseph Lane of the 22nd USCT, is one of those first Black troops who entered Richmond in April of 1865. And to bring that in, to use art to reimagine this space, to bring about different conversations. And while it's removed, this was a moment that I could see John Mitchell smiling down. Because in the end, he's like, we can have different conversations what the war meant, but we don't need to have this one. Let's not forget all of it. And that, I think, is something powerful that's happening. So a lot of community activism around here, alternate walking tours in the city of Richmond, and other histories that were hidden in plain sight are now becoming to the fore. So I think between education, healing, and discussion, and also creative arts, we can move forward. To my next slide, please. Which gets me to the one monument. There's very few monuments that I actually witnessed and had tears running down my face. The Richmond one, because I've done research on Richmond for so long. I was a part of the amicus brief for one of the removals of that one for the Virginia Supreme Court. I lent my eye as a historian. I was sad to see the reimagined base get removed. But it was a day I never thought would happen. Same with this one. I watched this on television from my apartment in Birmingham, Alabama. And I streamed. And I looked at this removal after the Charleston massacre happened. And then again, Charlottesville, the student population, alumni population started to try to convince the board of trustees of the school to remove it. But when we met with resistance, including being called cultural terrorists by our board of trustees for speaking out and to remind them of even Carr's speech, that was a moment of, okay, this is not going to be a good end. It's not going to be the end I wanted, but this moment, when it comes down, will be a different day for Carolina. And to watch this come down, because earlier in 2015, after the Charleston massacre, a graduate student wrote a poem honoring that Black woman that Carr talked about. Carr's speech circulated again and got reintroduced to new audiences. And when Silent Sam came down, on my website where I had his speech, full transcription of it, within 1 week I had 57,000 people read it. Because they wanted to know the dedication speech, they wanted to understand, they turned to history. And then having and zooming in and Skyping in with other classrooms from across the world, this became an education moment that sometimes I think people lost out in conversation. But on my campus at the University of Alabama, at the time witnessing this, our students were also having conversations. And this is where, at this moment, there was 3 options really for these monuments. One, they weren't coming down. They were staying up, but they were being contextualized. We started having groups like this and started having meetings and talking with one another instead of across from one another and around one another. And people started to really talk and have conversations of what these monuments meant. What are the possibilities? Can we add new monuments, add balance? Can we add an interpretive marker? Can we move this to a museum? What are the various options? We finally started having those conversations, but they did not go far. So very few monuments came down here. Next slide, please. It's George Floyd. I was grading the AP US History exam. I do every year. And I started seeing like one monument coming down, another monument coming down, another monument coming down, and I'm sort of like, okay, what's going on? It wasn't until I saw the New York Times do a map of the removals, and I looked at it and I'm like, that's too few. I've seen now in the past week, while doing the reading, at least 30 of these. So I did a Google My Map, thinking, let me just document this for teaching purposes. I stopped doing it because it just got overwhelming. So I did it for 3 years. And these are the various removals that happened. If you go to the next slide, please. Those are all the Confederate monuments. You notice there's ones in Arizona, ones in Colorado. But other ones in Florida, Houston, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina. Virginia beats North Carolina, but slightly. North Carolina had a lot of removals. If you go to the next slide, and add those that were tied to indigenous genocides and settler colonialism, a lot of Christopher Columbuses came down. Also to conquistadors and others, those are in green. This was the largest movement of removals in the modern era. With the exception of the Christopher Columbus ones, they were done within a democratic system. There would be a petition to the town board, there will be hearings, there will be people coming in and speak, a vote, usually unanimous or 1 or 2 dissented, and within 30 days it was removed. And when I look at that, I started to think about why now? What is going on here, but really documenting it. And if you go to the next slide, at the time of my stopping this is where all the ones that were still being promised for removal, including Splash Mountain. That's got to be now the Princess and the Frog Memorial. This is before the base renaming even became an option. And some of these have now been removed. So this summer I'm going to update the map and then also include all the new bases that have been renamed in there too. Because these memorials are still coming down. They just don't get the news. And a lot of it is because of work like this. These are the conversations that happen. The communities are deciding, what do we do with our memorials? How do we have conversations? What are the options? What fits us rather than what fits the national norm? What as a community can we live with? What can we not do? How do we move forward together? And that's something that has been building since 2015. So let me go to my next slide. So another thing that I witnessed was this memorial. This was the United Daughters of the Confederacy boulder. And you notice it's a big rock. This was its third location at the University of Alabama's campus, and I'm happy for Bryce Young because I will say this, football is a very violent sport. I watch these games and I always cringe when I heard those hits. The Alabama team, when you're in the nosebleeds, you hear that. But Nick Saban required the football team to take intro to AFAM studies and intro to women's studies. So I now have several former students who are in the NFL. So for me to see them and how they use the history in there too, so I always support students. So that meant I sat in the heat and I watched the football. So roll tide. But the United Daughters of the Confederacy boulder, my students and I use this as a teaching tool. I walked the campus all the time with them. They read the dedication speeches. They walked on the grass. They saw this in place. They understood its movement. And when George Floyd happened, several of my former students, who this was their third petition to try to get this removed, drafted a petition. They used Karen Cox's Dixie Daughters. They knew what the options were because they went to the archives. They understood what they wanted was, could you move this into a museum talking about slavery, the Civil War, and race more broadly at the University of Alabama? And then they also asked for Black faculty, less policing. They asked for a lot of other stuff, but they were like, can we move this from this space into a museum? Next slide. And on June 8th, after I graded AP, because we were online, I walked out because I received an email at 5 o'clock in the afternoon saying that the school had removed the plaques, for Confederate plaques from the campus. I walked there, I was one of the first people, because they brought out photographers to take pictures of this. I'm one of the first people to witness this. And I'm just like, oh, okay, this is gone. And I'm putting my hands where the holes were to mount the plaque, because it's the first time I could see it, and try to get an understanding of what the memorial was. And this picture that I posted online went viral. And you can tell I'm tired because I have a pink backpack on. Hair's a mess. I wasn't expecting this coming out of a long day. But the next day though, next slide, I witnessed this. It took 4.5 hours to lift this thing up, put it on a flatbed, and to move it into storage. And it will go into a museum. The removed plaques are in archives. Our students subsequently went and used them in their classes and see them. So this is going to go into a museum on campus. But the next slide. I'm standing on the site of where the memorial was. They just put sod down. And because that boulder was there and the seeping of the materials of the boulder into the ground, the grass grows differently there. So that's what I could tell between the geographic space. I walk there enough and look at the grass. I look at, okay, it's in the center of these two crossways. There's the Denny Chimes. Here's this, because it's in the geographic center. And to see this as a missed opportunity for a reimagining of the campus. So for me, one of the things I think about what is next for these places, you can add new. What does the new memorial look like? What's the new pathway to bring about the current community's understanding of this, but also the legacies of this removed memorial? You can always add context. And sometimes that is adding a new memorial to add balance. But it's going to cost some money. But you can add new. You can remove. And a lot of institutions chose to remove without acknowledging that it was there. And this is where these memorials never taught anything other than racial politics and where people belonged. It's still us in the classroom in meetings like this to teach. People teach. These don't always serve as good material for teaching. But the other is how to have these conversations. So the students who wrote the petitions that end up having about 30,000 signatures on them. When the memorial was lifted up on the flatbed, I sat there and watched them with tears running down their face because they didn't think the school was going to listen to them. So what happens when we start listening, hearing, talking to one another, hearing and developing solutions together? We might see something unimaginable, but also to a healing that we would not have expected otherwise. So my last slide for today is this one. So I said that my mom's family is from South Central Pennsylvania. And in Harrisburg in 2020, in 2 stages because of COVID, this memorial was placed. We are now seeing new memorials going up, a little attention going towards them. This is called a gathering at the crossroads. And I'm gonna try to use my mic here. We have Thomas Morris Chester, Jacob Compton, William Day, Francis Ellen Harper Watkins. In the middle is a podium with 100 names of abolitionists, Civil War veterans, and other freedom fighters from the 8th Ward of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The 8th Ward was the closest black community to the Capitol, and during the Civil War, it's adjacent to Camp Curtin, which is where white soldiers trained. In 1865, November of 1865, this was the site of the Grand Review of the returning USCT soldiers. When the May Grand Review in DC denied black soldiers participation, Harrisburg stepped up and had their own celebration for them. So this memorial celebrates the signing of the 15th Amendment and acknowledgement of the 19th Amendment. But this is a Civil War monument to the black community because Jacob Compton, one of the figures in there, but also T. Morris Chester, during the Gettysburg invasion and occupation of South Central Pennsylvania, where Harrisburg is almost taken, black civilians mount the defense, so they have to literally fight and defend Harrisburg. Jenkins' troops go up as far up as Mechanicsburg, so they're in the middle of the state. And there are seasoned African Americans in this way, even though. But Compton is one of those defenders. But in this monument that was put up in 2020, the artist chose an incident that he was also involved in before he enlisted in a USCT regiment out of Camp William Penn, Pennsylvania. He was the coach driver who helped rescue Abraham Lincoln when he's almost assassinated in Harrisburg in 1861. So he's dressed as a coachman. And it's his early Civil War history before he becomes a soldier. That's documented here. In the middle are those who helped enlist for black troops and those who organized that Grand Review. And during the summer of removals, we didn't talk about this memorial, but we should have talked about this one. So there's opportunities to add new, and the arts are another way to do that. And this memorial, those figures are tall, they're like 6 feet, so it's immersive. There's a biography of all the 100 names. They produce a booklet that's downloadable with all the biographies of the individuals listed. There's a map of the old 8th Ward on top, and it's on the Capitol grounds. This is what you can do when you have collaboration to correct the wrongs of one-sided memory. And that, I think, is where's our memorial like this in North Carolina? So one of the things I want to think about and conclude before we go into our things is the Cornelius one. I am returning, there's a lot of options that we can do, but one of the things is we have to talk together and figure out what they are. And it's not going to be easy conversations. But one of the things is I do know this history, I know the various options, but I am also a resident of Davidson. This is my community too. And when I first saw the memorial during my first year as the Vann Professor of Ethics and Society, I noticed two things right away. One, it's weird location. I was like, okay. But the fact that the little soldier on the top is staring and looking directly at where the Black community was located. So if they're coming into town, they're seeing this soldier telling them before they even get to the railroad tracks, you don't belong. And that is one of those things, is that's still conveying who belongs on which side of the track, much more than the railroad track does. So when we think about this conversation and think about that reaction, think about what messages it is still conveying, and how, if you claim you want an inclusive community, what might have to be done? Is that offense? I don't know. Is that turning the memorial? Because you can move it. You can rotate it to that's not facing the Black community anymore. Do you add a new memorial or memorials? Do you have teach-ins? Do you have, there's so many options, but there's not one option. But I'm willing to work and figure out what that option is, because this is my community too now. Thank you. You can advance to the next slide.